your children as they were growing up. I was born at just the right time. I was 4 when it first appeared on our local PBS station, the perfect age for this unique show. And paired with Sesame Street, which came out at the same time, this little white girl from the northernmost of the Taconic Mountains in upstate New York was suddenly learning about towns and cities, counting and spelling in English and Spanish, learning what other people looked like, what it meant to use our imagination, what it meant to be a neighbor. I was reminded of this powerful ministry, of this gentle Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh, when I watched the documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor a couple of years ago. And it struck me how important it was to hear these messages in the wake of the King assassination, in the midst of the Vietnam War, in the restlessness of the country in the late 60s and early 70s. Something that I, as a small child, knew nothing about, except that things seemed wrong, and the news was on a lot, and some of my schoolmates' dads never came home. I don't think it's a mistake that this documentary and last year's film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks, resonate so deeply. The lessons that Mr. Rogers was teaching us and is still teaching us help ground us when we feel utterly ungrounded. They are there for the taking, these things that Unitarian minister Robert Fulghum also reminded us that we learned in kindergarten. How to be kind, how to share, how to forgive, and how to take care of ourselves and each other. And we need these reminders. Too often, I fear we get so caught up in the hustle and bustle, the overwhelm of news, and lately, the real anxiety and the real sustained stress and trauma of our times and this pandemic. We get so caught up that we forget to pay attention to others. We forget that while we are the lead characters in our own stories, we are but bit players and maybe just background extras in the stories of other people. So many times, it seems, other people try to upstage us with their ideas or opinions or criticisms, or worse, we upstage them as if we're more important or valued. It's no wonder Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood continues to be so important. The ministry of Rogers focused on teaching children and us how to live out the assertion that we have inherent worth and dignity just by being who we are, and how we are all worth care and consideration. Now, I don't know what his spiritual life was like for a fact, but I bet that Roger's faithful Christianity was grounded in some of the lessons that come from what I think of as sometimes difficult, but ultimately helpful texts from the letters of Paul. There's one in particular from the letter to the Ephesians, and I say it's difficult because the writer uses the metaphor of marriage to explain his point. And here's where that pesky wives be subject to your husbands thing shows up, okay? I get it. I know. But what the writer is getting at here and states at the beginning and end of this passage is simply this: be subject to one another. Now, for those of you not familiar with the biblical text, this epistle or letter to the church in Ephesus is one of many written in the name of Paul of Tarsus, carrying on the ministry of someone who planted these Jesus churches around the Mediterranean. By this time, Paul has this collection of churches he has planted and now stewards, like our congregational consultants do. And, well, let's not kid ourselves. People 2,000 years ago were very much like people today. And any time you get a bunch of people collected in any kind of organization, eventually there will be unrest and misbehavior, especially when they're collected around a mission or a vision or a belief. These epistles aren't so much sacred text, maybe as swift kicks in our collective keisters. Over and over again, Paul is telling them to remember what holds you together. Stop bending the stories you have been told about Jesus to make you look good. And just stop being bad to one another. This letter to the Ephesians is no different. My hunch is that there was a lot of conflict and infighting there, and so this letter is very much reminding everyone to get along with one another, especially since the figure they're centering their organization around, Jesus, is most assuredly not keen on people treating each other with disrespect. In other words, this isn't so much about a particular belief or connection to a particular God. It's about you, and it's about me, which means it's about us. What we are talking about is seeing one another as family, as the people we devote our last measure of affection to. It's how we are seen and cared for and thought of. This is calling us back to our best selves, calling us to think about how we treat one another, the people we have known for months, years, decades, the people we work side by side with on committees and events and projects, the people we celebrate with and mourn with, the people who delight us and annoy us, and yet whom we consider family, the people who we see, care, think of, and hope we are seen by, cared for by, and thought of by. Now, I know people don't always get along. We don't get along all the time, especially when there are decades of history. I remember meeting some longtime members of a congregation I once served. And one afternoon I was to meet Dorothy, who had been a member for about 40 years, and then later with Caroline, who had been a member for about 40 years. Both women, not really named Caroline and Dorothy, but we'll use those names. Both women had served as the congregation's president, had been on various committees, taught religious education, occasionally spoke from the pulpit. I mean, they had done it all. In my conversation with Dorothy, I learned about the 7-year span that she and Caroline hadn't talked to one another because Caroline had done something terrible. But at some point they forgot about it and, well, they still argue a lot, but they talk. A few hours later, I learned from Caroline about how she and Dorothy hadn't talked for about 7 years because Dorothy had done something terrible, but at some point they forgot about it and, yeah, they still argue a lot, but they're mostly talking again. And mostly not talking trash about each other. My point, and I do have one, is that many of you have similar stories. We sometimes speak without thinking because, well, these people know me and I can say anything around them and it doesn't matter. But it does. And the way we treat each other and speak to each other can cause long-held grudges and hard rifts. We assume there's a level of trust, forgetting that trust needs to constantly be built and tended. I wonder if Caroline and Dorothy could have avoided the 7-year silence if they'd thought about how they were seeing each other, speaking to each other, and being subject to each other. Maybe they'd realized what had happened and made an effort to call one another back into covenant. I wonder what happens when we do. This stuff matters because if we don't get it right in our community, we have no hope of getting it right out in the world. Because being subject to one another is about family and friends and fellow members of this congregation, yes, but it's also about others outside our immediate scope. Right now, it's about the care we're showing others by staying home as much as we can, protecting ourselves and protecting each other in order to stop the spread of this devastating virus. This is how we treat strangers. This is about how we treat one another with our policies and our laws. This is how we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion. Now let me be clear. Being subject to one another is not about being subservient, as some might want to interpret that Ephesians text. This is not about an imbalance of power, or at least it shouldn't be. Rather, it is about attention, being attentive to one another, supporting one another, being kind to one another. And kindness does make a difference. Now, our story used the word nice, but I'm not really talking about being nice. Nice is wishy-washy. It rolls over. It doesn't want to offend. Nice is complacent. Nice doesn't want to make waves or make a stink and lets people have their own opinions even if they're not true. Nice doesn't want to bother anybody. Nice says comfort is more important than goodness, ease more valued than doing what's right. Blech. Kindness. Now, kindness is strong and active. Kindness sees a need and offers to help. In this time of pandemic, kindness wears masks and washes hands and keeps social distance. Kindness notices and speaks up and speaks out. Kindness makes sure everyone's taken care of, included, valued. Kindness is an act of justice, whether building ramps or protesting police brutality or changing classes' policies or calling for land and water protections or any of the other amazing things we do to affirm and promote all of us in this interdependent web as sacred and worthy. And kindness means sometimes shifting how we do things. It calls us to shed perfectionism, to welcome new ideas as a gift, not a challenge, to embrace complexity, to embrace discomfort on the way to something better, to take responsibility, to be thoughtful and caring in our words and actions, to take our time with what we say and do. We are called to be kind. Kindness is how we live into covenant with one another, how we act as Fred Rogers taught us to act, how the writer of Ephesians taught us to act. You see, there's a reason the writer of Ephesians uses marriage as a metaphor for being subject to one another. Because he's not just talking about affection for others, but understanding that when all is said and done, we are all part of one family, one body. How can we be unkind to one part of our body when it's so intrinsically a part of us? The gospel artist Hezekiah Walker sings, I need you, you need me. We're all a part of God's body. Stand with me, agree with me. We're all a part of God's body. It is God's will that every need be supplied. You are important to me. I need you to survive. I need you to survive. You need me to survive. Imagine when we think of others this way and show them that they matter, to see them as individuals, to see them as intrinsically important, to listen to their stories and consider their needs. Imagine if we thought of ourselves this way and we're kind to ourselves too. Because when we start acting that way toward ourselves and then each other, we begin to see how we can be subject to one another, even if other people are those who disagree with us. People we don't know, people we can only imagine are having experiences that we can never know. We are subject to one another when we stop building walls and start building bridges. We are subject to one another when we work for equal rights and equal pay and safety and clean water and accessibility for everyone. We are subject to one another when we join our forces together. Remembering Margaret Mead's words to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Marge Piercy, we have so much potential. Be subject to one another, pleads the writer of Ephesians, and Mr. Rogers, and every religious path worth its salt. Our commitment to covenant as Unitarian Universalists is a promise to be subject to one another, to be kind to one another, to forgive one another. We know this. We learned it as children, and it's what drew us to the life-saving message of our Unitarian Universalism. We just sometimes need to remember to notice each other's needs and seize the moment to act, to be willing to be uncomfortable in service to something greater than ourselves, to give of ourselves out of love and affection and compassion, to be truly kind, to think before we speak and speak with openness and generosity, to answer the call of our principles and our morals and our ethics and our faith. Let us be subject to one another. Amen, and blessed be.